You have a reputation, and whether it's good or bad, you are not the one who gets to decide what it is. Other people already have. Before you say anything, before you explain yourself, before you get a second chance. And if we're honest, we're always managing it. Managing what we post or what we say, the version of ourselves that we put out there for people to scroll past and judge. You know this. Everything you do shapes what people think about you. I don't mow my yard because I care how it looks. I mow it because I care how I look. Because if perception is reality, your reputation is as real as it gets. When the early church believers were just figuring out how to be the church, they had a good reputation. Look at Acts 5:12 through 13. The apostles were performing many miraculous signs and wonders among the people, and all the believers were meeting regularly at the temple in the area known as Solomon's Colonnade, but no one else dared to join them, even though all the people had high regard for them. So here we have the first century church, and in spite of the fact that they followed a guy who'd been executed by Rome, there was something about these believers that people respected, even when people were either too scared or too disinterested to join. And this isn't surprising because religion has always been invested in perception. I mean, Christians are taught that our reputation is something to take special care of because we represent Jesus to the world. But if that's true, we might not be doing such a great job. A recent study showed that among people who describe themselves as having no faith, only 32% have a positive view of Christians. And then when you just look at evangelical Christians, only 22% have a positive approval rating. The church has a reputation problem. Now, some people would say that's not a big deal because Jesus said that the world would hate him and hate his values. But it's crazy that Jesus has a higher approval rating than American Christianity. People like him, they just don't like the church. And this isn't a matter of doctrine or belief. This is what should bother us. When people walk away from Christianity, it's usually not because they've studied the arguments and rejected them. It's because of us. 42% of people with no faith say the reason they doubt Christianity is the hypocrisy of Christians. Not science or suffering, not intellectual questions, us. We're failing to represent Jesus well. And in a lot of cases, we are the reason people won't even consider him. So how did we get here? Well, the early church wasn't necessarily popular, but people respected them, if not their beliefs. How did it flip so much that the world at large likes Jesus more than the people who follow him? And the answer, I think, is found in the differences between how they took care of their reputation and how we do. Because somewhere along the way, we started measuring faith by the wrong things. Religion today says that your reputation is formed by what you restrict, by where you don't go, what you don't do, and who you don't do it with. This was my experience in Bible college. We couldn't go to the movie theater because people might think that we were going to an R-rated movie. Guys and girls couldn't go into each other's dorm rooms because people might think we were making out, or worse. We couldn't hang out with sinners because people might think that we were being influenced by them. And as future ministers, our reputations were precious, and we protected them by restricting where we went, what we did, and who we did it with. And maybe that's the religion you were handed. Your faith could be graded on what you don't do, don't taste, and don't touch. Those were the outward signs of inward transformation. But running away from something isn't the same thing as moving towards something. And when your faith becomes about subtraction instead of addition, eventually you're going to end up with nothing. And that's what happened to me. I was never closer to walking away from my faith than when I was in college training to be a professional Christian. For me, a faith based on what I didn't do, it was empty and unsatisfying, whether it made me look good or not. I looked right, but I was becoming someone I didn't even want to be. But the early church, they were different. They didn't build their reputation by what they avoided. They built it by who they moved toward. People respected them because of what they added, not what they subtracted. And so if hypocrisy is the reason people reject the church, what did the early church do that made people respect them? If our reputation is broken, what did they get right that we lost? We'll look at Acts 4:33 through 5:15. The apostles testified powerfully to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. As a result of the apostles' work, sick people were brought out into the streets on beds and mats so that Peter's shadow might fall across some of them as he went by. So in addition to meeting at the temple every day to pray and to hear the apostles' teaching, sick people were healed. And these public miraculous healings, they were the confirmation that Jesus was who he said he was. And they were the validation that God was with them, that the church was now his temple. But it was more than just miracles. This was a declaration of what the kingdom of God was about, the care and restoration of human beings. The church met in the temple to proclaim that Jesus is Lord, both now and into eternity, and it resulted in sick people being healed. Their method of evangelism was rooted in meeting people's needs, and it was the foundation of their good reputation. And you might say, well, this was more about the power of miracles than it is caring about sick people, but the miracles only happened for a season. It wasn't the norm. Regular healing miracles, it only happened for a time, not forever. And do you know what the church did when sick people weren't being healed supernaturally? They kept caring for them, healing them with their resources and their time and their presence. What did the church do? They proclaimed Jesus by meeting people's needs. And that's what gave them a reputation people couldn't ignore. Now, let's check out where they did this. And this part matters a lot more than you think, because where they went, it tells you exactly who they were willing to move toward. So if their faith wasn't oriented around the places they avoided, where did they go? Let's look at Acts 5:12. All the believers were meeting regularly at the temple in the area known as Solomon's Colonnade. So Solomon's Colonnade was a covered outer walkway of the Jewish temple. It had columns on both sides and a covered roof. And so it was a good place for people to gather outside of the sun. And like Jesus, the apostles taught there. But look where it sits. It sits at the outskirts of the temple. God's presence was supposed to be at the center of the temple. That's where the power is, the influence and the honor. But the church planted themselves on the edge, not where the powerful met, but where the people at the margins gathered. And their location said something. It said, God isn't just found at the center of the temple anymore. Now he's here among his people. We are the temple of God now, and he can be found anywhere you find followers of Jesus. The church didn't hide from the world. They went into it, to the outskirts of the temple, to the outskirts of the religion that Jesus came to both challenge and fulfill. But Solomon's Colonnade, it doesn't just show us where they did what they did. It also reveals who they did it with and for. See, the temple was structured in layers. Look at this. The closer you got to the center of the temple, the fewer people were allowed in. Okay, so foreigners stayed on the outside. And then women, they could go a little bit further, but there was a limit to where they could go. And then certain men in good standing could go further, but only priests were allowed into the inner court. And even then, only the high priest could go in all the way. So, in other words, access to God was restricted. And the deeper you went, the more exclusive it became. And where did the church go? Not the center. They went to the edge, to the place everyone could go. You can see in the geography of the temple that it got more and more limiting on who was allowed in, on who had access to God. So, in other words, the closer you got to the center, the fewer people were allowed in. And then the further out you went, the more people were included. So where the church chose to stand, it wasn't random. It was a statement. In the Mishnah, which was a book of ancient rabbinic writing, there's this list, a more specific list of who is excluded in the temple. Check out what it says here. It says, all are subject to the command to appear in the temple, excepting a deaf mute, an imbecile, a child, one of doubtful sex, one of double sex, women, slaves that have not been freed, a man that is lame or blind or sick or aged, and one that cannot go up on his feet. So the sick, the disabled, the impaired. people whose sex or gender was indeterminate, people who had no power or honor in society, like women or slaves or the elderly. The elderly couldn't care for themselves. And where was Solomon's colonnade? It was on the outer edge of the court of Gentiles, where all of those people could go. Everyone had access. Unlike the stricter areas of the temple, the apostles could preach and heal without separating people by race or gender or health or ability. And if you're the kind of person who would have been pushed to the edges, this is for you. If you've ever felt overlooked or left out and unwanted, like you don't belong in the spaces where God is supposed to be, the entire Jesus movement was built to move toward you, not away from you. This isn't about getting you into a group. It's about bringing you back to God, about giving you a place where you actually belong and making you whole again. The people everyone else filtered out, they were the people Jesus built everything around. Look at this whole section put together in Acts 5:14 through 16. Yet more and more people believed and were brought to the Lord, crowds of both men and women. And as a result of the apostles' work, sick people were brought out into the streets on beds and mats, so Peter's shadow might fall across some of them as he went by. Crowds came from villages around Jerusalem, bringing their sick and those possessed by evil spirits, and they were all healed. So Luke, who's the author of Acts, he makes a point to show that people who would have defiled the temple were included. Gentiles, women, the sick, those with unclean spirits. That even where the church physically gathered was an embodied act of inclusion. Because their faith wasn't defined by who they avoided. It was defined by who they moved toward. When you take a step back and you look at the early church, their reputation didn't come from what they avoided. It came from three things: where they went, what they did, and who they did it with. And if we're honest, we flipped it. We've built a version of faith that's mostly about what we don't do, where we don't go, and who we don't associate with. And we've called that faithfulness. But the early church shows us something different. Avoidance didn't make them faithful. Engagement did. And it's the same for you. Here's the thing. Your faith isn't measured by what you avoid. It's revealed by who you move toward. That's why people respected them, even when those people didn't believe the same things. And that might be why people struggle to respect the church now. Not because of what we believe, but because of who we move toward or don't. It's easy to talk about the church like it's out there somewhere, like it's just a thing that we observe and judge from a distance. But the reputation of the church, it's just the sum of our lives and how we live them. It's you and it's me. It's what people experience when they experience us. And the direction of your life is shaping what people think about Jesus. And so if we want a different reputation, it starts by living like Jesus lived, thinking like he thought, and doing what he taught. So the question isn't just what kind of church we are. The question is, what kind of person are you becoming? Is your faith measured by what you avoid, or is it revealed by who you move toward? Maybe your religious tradition is so ingrained that you can't even tell anymore, because your faithfulness has been more defined by what you don't touch than who you're moving toward. And so to clear it up, ask yourself a few questions. Who are you moving toward? Who have you stopped moving toward? And who would it cost you to move toward? It might be the classmate everybody avoids, or the coworker you've written off. It could be the family member that you keep at arm's length. And not because they're easy, but because they're not. Because that's exactly where the early church went. That's exactly where God was working. And that's exactly where their reputation was built. For some of you, this isn't just about who you move toward. It's about realizing that God has been moving toward you this whole time. Even when you felt pushed out, even when you felt like you didn't measure up, you weren't outside of what God was doing. You were exactly who he was moving toward. If we want a different reputation, we need a different direction. Not away from people, but toward them. Because the reputation of the church won't change until the direction of our lives does. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.